Hi everyone, welcome to the channel After All That Years.
I discovered my wife was having an affair on a Tuesday night in October, and by Christmas, I had dismantled her entire world piece by piece. The evening started normally enough. Margaret was getting ready for another one of her friends' parties, standing at our bedroom mirror in that cream-colored dress she'd bought last month. I was reading in my armchair, listening to the distant hum of traffic through our apartment windows when she called out, asking how she looked. "Beautiful," I told her, same as always, but something in her smile felt rehearsed, like she was practicing for an audience that wasn't me. Looking back, I should have noticed the signs months earlier. The way she'd started holding her phone face down on the kitchen counter. How she'd begun working late 3 nights a week instead of her usual one. The new perfume that appeared on our bathroom counter without explanation. At 62, I'd been married to Margaret for 15 years, and I thought I knew her rhythms better than my own heartbeat. "Richard's having his annual holiday thing," she said, spinning once to check the dress from behind. "You're still coming, right?" Of course, I nodded, though these gatherings always made me feel like a fish swimming upstream. Margaret thrived in crowds, had since the day I met her at a fundraiser back in 2008. She could work a room like a politician, remembering everyone's children's names and asking about their jobs with genuine interest. Me? I preferred quiet conversations over coffee, maybe a book on the weekend. But marriage is about compromise, and watching her light up around people had always been worth my discomfort. The party was already loud when we arrived. Margaret immediately gravitated toward a cluster of her co-workers near the kitchen island, leaving me to nurse a bourbon and nod politely at acquaintances. That's when I first saw him. Tall, probably mid-40s, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never being told no. He inserted himself into Margaret's circle with practiced smoothness, and within minutes she was laughing at something he'd said. I told myself it meant nothing. Margaret laughed with everyone, but as the night wore on, I found myself watching them more closely. The way he leaned in when she spoke, how she touched his forearm when making a point. Small gestures, probably innocent, but they gnawed at something deep in my chest. Around 11, I stepped onto the host's small balcony for air. The December cold bit through my jacket, but it felt good after the stuffiness inside. When I turned back toward the sliding door, I saw them through the glass. Margaret and this stranger, standing close enough that their shoulders almost touched. She was looking up at him with an expression I hadn't seen in months, maybe years. Open, interested, alive. My stomach dropped like I'd swallowed ice water. She must have sensed my stare because she glanced toward the balcony. For just a moment, our eyes met through the glass, and I watched guilt flicker across her face before she quickly looked away. She said something to him, I couldn't hear what, and then walked toward the door with a bright, artificial smile. "There you are," she said, sliding the door open. "You looked like you needed some air. Everything okay?" "Fine," I managed. "Just hot in there." She nodded, but her eyes were already drifting back toward the party. "Ready to head home soon? I'm getting tired." We left 20 minutes later, riding home in silence while Margaret scrolled through her phone. I kept replaying that moment on the balcony, the look on her face when she saw me watching. In our bedroom, she went through her usual routine, washing her face, brushing her teeth, slipping into the oversized t-shirt she'd worn to bed for years. But when she kissed me goodnight, it felt like kissing a stranger. I lay awake until nearly 3, listening to her steady breathing beside me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, saw the way she'd lit up around him. Margaret had always been social, but this felt different, personal. When morning came, I was still staring at the ceiling, my mind churning with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. The next day, Margaret left for work with barely a word, grabbing her coffee and kissing my cheek in passing. "Late meeting tonight," she called over her shoulder. "Don't wait up." 3 late meetings in 1 week seemed excessive, even for her job at the marketing firm. But I'd learned not to question Margaret's work schedule. She'd always been ambitious, driven in ways that both attracted and intimidated me. Still, as I sat in my home office that morning, pretending to review insurance claims, I couldn't shake the image of her with that man. His name, I learned later, was Jonathan. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to look through Margaret's phone, something I'd never done in 15 years of marriage. I waited until she was in the shower, her phone charging on the nightstand, and opened her messages with shaking hands. The texts weren't explicitly romantic, but they didn't need to be. Inside jokes I wasn't part of. Plans to grab coffee, to continue our conversation from last night. A photo of him at some restaurant I'd never been to, with Margaret's response, "Looks amazing. Wish I was there." I set the phone down carefully, my hands trembling. In 34 years of marriage, first to my late wife Helen, then to Margaret, I'd never felt anything quite like this. It was like discovering that gravity worked differently than I'd always believed. That evening, Margaret came home at her usual time, humming under her breath as she hung up her coat. She asked about my day while reheating leftover soup, and I gave her the same generic responses I always did. But watching her move around our kitchen, I felt like I was looking at a stranger wearing my wife's face. Over the following weeks, I became a detective in my own home. I noted when Margaret showered before work events instead of after. I listened to her phone conversations from the next room, hearing the laugh she saved for people she was trying to impress. I memorized her new patterns, the Tuesday and Thursday client dinners, the sudden interest in weekend work conferences. The worst part wasn't the lying itself, but how effortlessly she did it. Margaret had always been organized, methodical. She applied the same skills to deception that she used for everything else, creating elaborate schedules and backup stories with the precision of a project manager. Sometimes I almost admired her thoroughness. By January, I had enough evidence to confront her, but something held me back. Maybe it was cowardice. Maybe it was the hope that I was wrong, that 15 years of marriage meant something more than this. Or maybe I just wasn't ready to blow up the life we'd built together, even if it was built on quicksand. The breaking point came on a Friday night in late January. Margaret had claimed another work dinner, this time with potential new clients from out of town. She'd dressed carefully, the black dress she'd worn to my nephew's wedding, her grandmother's pearl earrings, and spent 20 minutes on makeup. An hour after she left, I found myself in the car, driving downtown toward the restaurant she'd mentioned. I told myself I was just going for a drink, maybe dinner alone. But when I pulled into the parking lot and saw Margaret's Honda next to a silver BMW, I knew I'd been lying to myself too. Through the restaurant's front window, I could see them at a corner table. Margaret was leaning forward, her chin propped on her hand, in a gesture I remembered from our early dating days. Jonathan was speaking animatedly, his hands moving as he talked, and she was watching him with complete attention. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, engine running, heat blasting, watching my wife fall in love with another man. When they finally stood to leave, Margaret's hand brushed his as they walked toward the door, and I saw her smile. Not the polite practice smile she wore at parties, but something genuine and unguarded. I drove home through empty streets, my mind strangely calm. The worst part was over. Now I knew. Margaret came home at 11:30, claiming the dinner had run late because the clients were really chatty. She asked how my evening was while brushing her teeth, and I told her I'd watched a documentary and gone to bed early. We were both lying, but at least now we were doing it knowingly. That weekend, I made a decision. Instead of confronting Margaret directly, I started building a case. I opened my own checking account and began transferring money gradually, small amounts that wouldn't trigger her attention. I contacted Jim Patterson, a divorce attorney I'd known since college, and scheduled a consultation. I even hired a private investigator, something I'd never imagined doing outside of movies. "How long has this been going on?" Jim asked, reviewing the photos the investigator had taken of Margaret and Jonathan at various restaurants and coffee shops. "Actively, maybe 3 months, but I think she's been unhappy longer than that." Jim nodded, making notes in his legal pad. "Any joint assets we need to worry about? Business interests?" "The house is in both names, her retirement account, my pension, savings. Pretty standard stuff." I paused, looking at a photo of Margaret laughing at something Jonathan had said. "I don't want to destroy her, Jim. I just want to be done." "Understood. But Gerald, you need to protect yourself here. 15 years of marriage means she's entitled to half of everything you've built together, affair or not. Virginia's no-fault divorce laws." "I know," I interrupted, "but I also know Margaret. She won't fight dirty unless she's backed into a corner. If I handle this right, we can keep it civilized." I was wrong about that, but I wouldn't learn it for several more weeks. February passed in a strange kind of limbo. Margaret continued her elaborate deceptions, and I continued pretending to believe them. We maintained the surface rituals of marriage, shared meals, discussions about weekend plans, even occasional physical intimacy that felt like we were both acting out a scene from a play neither of us wanted to be in. The only time I felt truly like myself was during my meetings with Jim, planning the divorce like a military campaign. We discussed asset division, timeline, strategy. It felt good to be taking action instead of just absorbing Margaret's lies like a human sponge. "The investigator got some interesting information," Jim said, during one of our meetings in late February. "This Jonathan character, he's married too, wife and 2 teenage kids in Richmond." I stared at the photos Jim slid across his desk. Jonathan with his family at what looked like a school event, everyone smiling for the camera. "Does she know?" "About Margaret? Unclear, but she will soon. My guess is your wife doesn't know about the family either." That detail sat with me for days. Margaret thought she was falling in love with a single man, someone who could offer her a future. The reality was messier, more complicated. Part of me wanted to warn her, to protect her from the same kind of betrayal she was inflicting on me. But a larger part, a part I wasn't entirely proud of, wanted to let her discover the truth on her own. The confrontation finally came on a Thursday evening in early March. Margaret was getting ready for another client dinner, humming while she applied lipstick in the bedroom mirror. I was sitting on the edge of our bed, watching her routine, when something inside me finally snapped. "How long have you been seeing Jonathan?" I asked quietly. Her hand froze halfway to her mouth, lipstick tube suspended in midair. In the mirror, I watched her face go through several expressions: surprise, panic, calculation, before settling on defiance. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The restaurant owner who lives in Richmond, married with 2 kids, drives a silver BMW. Ring any bells?" She turned around slowly, her face pale, but her chin raised stubbornly. "You had me followed." "I did." I kept my voice level, though my heart was hammering. "The photos are quite good. You look happy in them." For a long moment, we just stared at each other. 15 years of marriage, and it had come to this: 2 people who'd become strangers, caught in a lie that had grown too big for either of us to handle gracefully. "Gerald, she started, then stopped. "This isn't how I wanted you to find out." "But you weren't planning to tell me either." She sat down heavily in the chair by our dresser. suddenly looking every one of her 58 years. I didn't plan for this to happen. It just did. Affairs don't just happen, Margaret. They're choices, hundreds of small choices over weeks and months. She was quiet for so long, I thought she might not respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I've been unhappy for a long time, Gerald. Not with you specifically, just with everything. My job, our routine, the way we've settled into this comfortable but boring life. Jonathan makes me feel alive again. So you decided to blow up our marriage instead of talking to me about it. Would it have made a difference? She looked up at me with tired eyes. When was the last time we had a real conversation? When did we last laugh together? Really laugh? I wanted to argue, to defend our life together, but the words caught in my throat. She wasn't entirely wrong. We had fallen into patterns, comfortable routines that felt safe, but weren't particularly exciting. The difference was that I'd been content with safety. She'd been suffocating in it. What do you want to do now? I asked. I don't know. She rubbed her forehead, smearing her carefully applied makeup. I need time to think. Take all the time you need, I said, standing up. But take it somewhere else. I've already spoken to a lawyer. The color drained completely from her face. Gerald, please. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. Figure out how to fix things. There's nothing left to fix, I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. You made your choice, Margaret. Now I'm making mine. She left that night, taking a suitcase of clothes and promising to call me in a few days. I sat in our living room afterward, surrounded by 15 years of shared memories photos from our honeymoon in Ireland. The coffee table we'd picked out together, her reading glasses forgotten on the kitchen counter, and felt oddly peaceful for the first time in months. The next morning, I changed the locks and filed for divorce. Margaret's reaction to the divorce papers was swift and furious. The woman who'd been apologetic and remorseful on Thursday became vindictive by the following Tuesday. She hired her own lawyer and began fighting every detail: asset division, timeline, even custody of our elderly cat, Oliver. She wants half your pension, half the house value, and spousal support, Jim explained during an emergency meeting. Plus, she's claiming emotional distress damages. Emotional distress? I almost laughed. She's the one who had the affair. Doesn't matter in Virginia. No-fault divorce laws mean infidelity isn't considered when dividing assets. But Gerald, there's something else. He slid another photo across his desk. The investigator got this yesterday. The photo showed Margaret sitting in a coffee shop, tears streaming down her face, while Jonathan patted her hand awkwardly across the table. Even in the grainy surveillance image, his discomfort was obvious. Looks like she found out about his family, Jim said. I studied the photo, feeling an unexpected pang of sympathy for Margaret. Whatever else she'd done, she hadn't deserved to be deceived about Jonathan's marital status. How is she handling it? Not well, from what I understand. The investigator says Jonathan ended things last week, told her he couldn't leave his kids. So Margaret had lost both her marriage and her affair in the span of 2 weeks. I should have felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt tired. This wasn't how either of us had imagined our story would end. The divorce proceedings dragged on for 4 months, growing nastier as Margaret's situation became more desperate. She'd moved in with her sister Linda temporarily, but it was clear she couldn't afford to maintain her lifestyle without my income. Her attempts to claim larger portions of our assets became increasingly aggressive, and more than once I wondered if I was looking at a complete stranger. The breaking point came during a mediation session in June. Margaret's lawyer was arguing for additional spousal support when she suddenly stood up and pointed at me across the conference table. 15 years, she said, her voice shaking with rage. I gave you 15 years of my life, and this is how you repay me? By throwing me away the moment things get difficult? I didn't throw you away, I replied quietly. You left. You chose someone else over our marriage. I made a mistake, she shouted. One mistake in 15 years, and you're willing to destroy everything we built together. It wasn't one mistake, Margaret. It was months of lies, months of choosing him over me every single day. That's not a mistake. That's a pattern. She sank back into her chair, tears flowing freely now. For a moment, she looked like the woman I'd fallen in love with 7 years ago. Vulnerable, human, real. But the moment passed, and when she spoke again, her voice was cold. I hope you're happy, she said. I hope this revenge makes you feel better about yourself. This isn't about revenge, I told her. It's about self-respect. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in late July. We met at the courthouse to sign the final papers, our lawyers handling most of the details, while Margaret and I sat on opposite sides of the room like strangers, waiting for different buses. She'd gotten half the house value, a portion of my pension, and 3 years of spousal support, more than I'd wanted to give, but less than she'd demanded. As we left the courthouse, she paused on the steps and looked back at me one last time. I did love you, Gerald, she said quietly. I want you to know that. I loved you, and I'm sorry for how this ended. I know, I replied. I loved you too. That's why this hurts so much. She nodded, tears threatening again, and walked away toward Linda's car. I watched her go, this woman who'd been my partner for 15 years, and felt something like grief settle in my chest. Not for our marriage, that had been dying long before Jonathan appeared, but for the people we'd been before, everything went wrong. That evening, I sat in my newly empty house, with Oliver purring on my lap and a glass of whiskey in my hand, thinking about the man I'd been 6 months ago. He'd been comfortable, complacent, maybe even a little boring. But he'd also been trusting, optimistic about the future, secure in his relationships. This new version of me was harder, more careful, quicker to spot deception. I wasn't sure if that was an improvement or just a necessary adaptation to reality. Either way, there was no going back. Margaret tried to contact me a few times in the months following the divorce. Texts asking about practical matters, mail that was still coming to the house, shared acquaintances who'd invited us both to events. I answered the practical questions and ignored the rest. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't interested in friendship either. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. I heard through mutual friends that she'd eventually moved to North Carolina to be closer to her daughter from her first marriage. She found work with a smaller marketing firm, and according to Linda, seemed to be doing well under the circumstances. I was glad to hear it. Whatever else had happened between us, I'd never wanted Margaret to suffer permanently for her choices. As for Jonathan, he apparently stayed with his wife, though their marriage reportedly went through a rough patch when everything came to light. His wife contacted me once, a brief email expressing sympathy for what we'd both been through. I never responded, but I appreciated the gesture. We were both casualties of other people's selfishness. The hardest part about starting over at 62 wasn't the loneliness or the practical challenges of managing a household alone. It was rebuilding trust, not just in other people, but in my own judgment. How had I missed the signs for so long? How had I become so comfortable in a marriage that my wife could slip away for months without my noticing? I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Patricia Chen, recommended by my physician. She was a small, direct woman in her 40s who specialized in late-life transitions. "You're grieving," she told me during one of our early sessions. "Not just the marriage, but the version of yourself that existed within that marriage. That man trusted easily, assumed the best in people. His worldview was fundamentally optimistic. It makes sense that losing him would feel like a death." "So what now?" I asked. "How do I move forward without becoming bitter?" "You don't have to choose between naivety and bitterness," she said. There's a third option. Wisdom. Learning to see people clearly without losing your capacity for connection. It took me nearly a year to understand what she meant. Wisdom, I learned, wasn't about protecting yourself from all possible hurt. It was about accepting that relationships involve risk while still believing that risk could be worthwhile. I started dating again the following spring, mostly at the insistence of my daughter Sarah from my first marriage. She'd been wonderfully supportive throughout the divorce, calling regularly and visiting more often than usual. "Dad," she said, during one of her visits, "you can't let Margaret's betrayal turn you into a hermit. You're 63, not 93. You have decades of life left to live." She was right, though dating in your 60s proved to be a completely different experience than dating in your 20s or even your 40s. The stakes felt both higher and lower because time felt more precious. Lower because most of the people I met had been through their own divorces and disappointments. I met Carol at a book club the library hosted monthly. She was 60, a retired teacher whose husband had died of cancer 3 years earlier. We bonded over our shared love of mystery novels and our mutual bewilderment at modern technology. Our first date was coffee and conversation that lasted 4 hours. Our second was dinner and a movie, followed by more conversation on her front porch until nearly midnight. "I'm not looking to replace my marriage to David," she told me on our fourth date as we walked through the botanical gardens. "That relationship was perfect for who I was then, but I'm a different person now, and I'm curious about who I might become with someone new." I appreciated her honesty. I wasn't looking to replace my marriage to Margaret either, or even to Helen for that matter. Each relationship existed in its own context, with its own possibilities and limitations. Carol and I have been together for 2 years now. We maintain separate homes, but spend most evenings together, cooking dinner and watching the news, reading in comfortable silence, talking about our grown children and their various dramas. It's not the passionate romance of youth, but it's something better suited to this stage of life, companionship built on mutual respect and genuine affection. I still think about Margaret sometimes, usually when I'm paying bills or doing household maintenance that we used to share. I wonder if she found whatever she was looking for, whether the excitement she craved with Jonathan was worth the stability she lost with me. I hope she's happy, though I suspect happiness was never really the point for her. She wanted to feel alive, significant, desired. Those are harder things to sustain than happiness. As for me, I learned that 62 wasn't too late to start over, though it required letting go of some assumptions about who I was and what I wanted. The man who'd been married to Margaret had been comfortable with routine, content with quiet satisfaction. This newer version of myself is more intentional about seeking joy, more direct about expressing needs, more willing to take emotional risks. Would I change what happened if I could? Some days yes, some days no. The betrayal was painful, but it also forced me to examine a life I'd been living on autopilot. The divorce was messy and expensive, but it taught me things about my own resilience that I might never have discovered otherwise. Margaret made her choices, and I made mine. In the end, that's all any of us can do. Choose how to respond when life doesn't unfold according to our expectations. I chose to rebuild rather than retreat, to remain open rather than close off, to trust carefully rather than stop trusting entirely. Some might call that wisdom. I just call it survival.